The British Prime Minister Theresa May has got a problem. It's called Brexit. She's under pressure from European Union leaders to compromise in order to prevent a collapse in Brexit talks and a no-deal departure from the world's largest trading bloc. Despite these ongoing talks, which have now lasted around 2 years, British and EU officials continue to hold each other responsible for delays and problems in finding a lasting solution to the Brexit arrangements. And more than once, these talks have looked close to collapse.
So far, Mrs May has failed to convince European Union negotiators about the terms of the divorce agreement. Even though the British Prime Minister herself says she is optimistic a deal will be done, EU leaders, commentators and many others now say that it is Britain that should back down on some of its demands. French President Emmanuel Macron even said it was up to London to settle political differences at home. As part of the opposition to the Brexit agenda, a large demonstration took place in central London to demand an end to Brexit. They wanted another referendum, or even a simple end to the whole Brexit agenda. Others were claiming the public should have a right to a final say on the deal that will be negotiated between Prime Minister Theresa May and the EU in the upcoming weeks, assuming she can secure a deal at all.
Does the British public understand what Brexit actually means? And would another referendum on Brexit lead to a different result? Simple questions with important answers. Let's start with this. What is the public's opinion about how the Brexit talks are going? We asked them. Here's what they said.
There seems to be complete confusion on our side, so we're in a very weak position to negotiate.
I think that the Chequers agreement is not going to do it. There should be a second referendum because I don't think the first referendum was honest. The European leaders are not sounding too happy. I know they're making nice noises to support May, but I'm not at all happy about it.
There's a lot of confusion around the talks and people are not that well informed. But I think there are steps being taken by Parliament to let people be more aware of what's going on. But of course it's tricky because there's only so much they can tell us.
I don't recognise my country anymore, to be perfectly honest, and that's the saddest thing. The talks, it's almost as if nobody wants to be left holding the ball when they finish. So let's talk it into oblivion and hopefully it never ends, you know.
It's really worrying for me because whatever goes really terribly wrong is going to affect me with my commute into work every day. Honestly, if you could paint a worst case scenario, we're in it right now.
Well, they're not going well at all. There was no plan, there is no plan, and almost 2.5 years on, we are no nearer forward than we were prior to the referendum.
So I don't think the talks are going anywhere at the moment, which is a huge, huge disappointment.
Talks are terrible, but any divorce, it's always going to be bad. If you've ever been divorced, you'll know that.
I don't think any agreement we reach is going to be as good as staying in the European Union. And this country's got to stand up, and politicians have got to stand up and say that with courage.
Well, it would be possible to imagine talks that went worse, but you'd have to use your imagination. I mean, it's a total train wreck car crash. You would have thought there's one country over here negotiating with 26, 27 over there, and you'd think that the one country would know what it wanted and the 27 would have a lot of trouble working out what they wanted from the negotiations. The opposite is true. It's not clear yet that the government of this country, in terms of, which represents a particular political party, has been able to agree among itself. All the negotiations have been inside the Conservative Party, and of course, once you reach an agreement with such difficulty with the Conservative Party, it's going to be extremely difficult then to change that when you come to talk to the Europeans. But of course, when you negotiate with anybody, you have to be willing to change. So what the car crash that's coming is an absolutely inflexible Prime Minister, inflexible by character, with an impossible bargain that she's tried to hatch with her own party, meeting quite a flexible people on the other side, but they are united. And the result is going to be a car crash.
Well, they're not going very well at all. They were supposed to have reached an agreement in Brussels last week, and now it looks as though it'll have to go to another summit in November, which might be a no-deal summit because the sides are still far apart. Of course, it's very difficult for Theresa May, the Prime Minister, because her Tory party is split 3 different ways. Some of them want to remain and really want a very soft Brexit. She's going by what was called the Chequers Plan, which was a compromise between the hard line and the soft line. And then there are the hard line people in her own party who want to just leave the EU without any deal at all and say it would be much better just to walk away and go back on the World Trade Organization, WTO rules. And then there's the EU side, which is being very tough and demanding much more guarantees of legal binding arrangements than Theresa May is willing to give.
European Union leaders, commentators and many others now say that it is Britain that should compromise to prevent a collapse in Brexit talks. What are the public's thoughts?
Well, I think in a negotiation, both sides eventually need to compromise.
I find it really difficult because I just don't think we should be doing it at all. But yes, we should compromise, and we should certainly stay in the single market and the customs union.
They should assess what they need to compromise on and what they definitely think isn't feasible in terms of compromising. So again, they know more details about that and should make that call, that judgment.
There's no way you could exit it easily because if you can't agree trade deals until you've completely come out of it, but we're talking about a country, you know.
We need to make sure that we're giving as good as we get, because the point that people voted was on certain promises. Just expecting us to get everything our way is never going to work like that.
I don't think we should compromise. I think Brexit talks, the worse it's going, the better it is to end this nonsense once and for all.
I think the talk should collapse because I think Parliament should take back control and actually decide what is best for the country and not leave it to some sort of vote that takes place on TV reality shows.
I'm one of the ones that voted to leave, and they don't want us to go, so they're not going to make it easy.
Now that we know where we're at 2 years, or 2 years or so down the line, is that the full understanding of what the impact of Brexit is economically, culturally and for all other reasons. Now that's fully known, what's better than making an informed choice? So don't compromise, don't fudge, put it back to the people for a clear and emphatic answer. Now we know pretty much the full details of what it's going to do to this country.
There is every negotiation requires flexibility. And as I was just saying, the British government has put itself in a position where it doesn't have the flexibility. So it is going into negotiations where it feels it cannot budge because of the deals that have had to be done back home. And yet, in that case, what they're actually saying to Europe is, take it or leave it. I think Europe has probably got more room to be flexible, but then they have the difficulty that if they change their position, they've got 27 countries that have got to sign up to. They probably will, because they're behaving like grown-ups in the room, and the British government is not. It's behaving like children, or a number of children having a temper tantrum. So I think that the compromises will be necessary from the British and will be unavailable.
Well, I think that's a little bit unfair because I think Theresa May has made lots of compromises already, which is why there is so much of a revolt on her backbenches. They feel that she's made too many concessions, and that's why Boris Johnson resigned and David Davis resigned, because they say in the original Lancaster House speech where she laid out her red lines a year or so ago, she's already backed off on some of those red lines. So I think she has she's given a lot of ground towards the EU, and the EU really is just sticking with this same principle that they stuck with at the beginning, saying there are the 4 basic principles of the EU and nothing can be changed and she has to accept all of them. Well, if you're going to find a compromise, there has to be some give on the European Union side as well.
Does the public think that people here in Britain do have a clear understanding about what Brexit actually means?
Partly because the issues are complicated, and partly because the choices have been very badly represented, and so people have just got too much information and they can't see clearly what the choices really are.
No, and I'm not sure that I do totally, but I certainly don't. I think it's a really complicated question. People don't understand all the different trade deals that need to be done, what's happening to the pharmaceutical industry, etc., etc.
I don't think they understood quite what they were getting themselves into when they did vote for, in the referendum.
No, I think the more that they understand it, the less they want to understand it, and the less they want to hear about it. And sadly, the closer we're getting, the more we're going to hear about it.
No, I mean, if you look just after the election, the most Googled term was, what is Brexit? I think with all of the spin on both sides of it, a large swathe of the public had no idea and were voting on gut rather than actually valid points because they didn't know who to believe.
And I don't think there's a single person alive that fully understands the complexities of this.
How can they? How can we have a clear understanding of something that's not, well, it's so complicated? It's not a clear case of yes or no, in or out. I mean, I've always thought plebiscites are the worst way to try and decide big issues.
I think we understand about 70%. It's not about understanding or not understanding. It's about what you feel in your heart.
It must be getting clearer because it's been given so much more, airing in the press. So much has been said.
It's a fiendishly complex problem. I suspect that most of the people who are now engaged in negotiations realise they didn't understand it fully at the beginning. Certainly, almost nobody who voted, the 30-odd million of us, kind of had any idea of the ramifications, how it might affect, I don't know, medicines or air travel. But least of all, I mean, I didn't hear anybody before the vote ever mentioning the Irish border. Nobody saw that it was relevant. And now we know that it's possibly the sticking point, because we hadn't noticed this curious thing that there would be a land border between the European Union and Great Britain, and a land border between groups that have different taxation and systems, etc., has to have barriers. But there is a commitment on Ireland not to have barriers, and I think people understand that better now. But they know that most people. It doesn't mean they've necessarily changed their position, but they know that whatever position they took was based on incomplete information.
No, I don't think the public has a clear idea at all. I mean, it is very complex in itself. They haven't put all their cards on the table. We don't know exactly what she's negotiating. So there's a problem there of lack of information and a lack of trust. And then, of course, these issues are extremely complicated. They need the so-called backstop, which has been talked about all the time. Very few people in Britain and the general public know what this backstop is about. They know it's got something to do with Ireland. And of course, it is difficult to find a compromise that satisfies everybody. And it could be a fudge in terms of the wording. So that also adds to the sense of confusion and ambiguity. Even when we finally see a deal, will we know what it actually means? Then there's the question of timing. It's all going to be put forward to the transition period. There's going to be a transition period of about 2 years. And it may be that a lot of the finer points of detail won't be negotiated until during this 2-year transition period and possibly towards the end of it.
In 1975, Britain held a referendum on European Communities membership. The result was 67% in favour and 33% against. So Britain joined. However, in 2016, a referendum held on whether the UK should continue as a member of the European Union delivered a different result. This time, 48% said yes, but 52% voted to leave. As the Brexit debate continues, pro-EU Remain campaigners held a demonstration in London, claiming their march for another referendum attracted 700,000 supporters.
Many believe that the rerun of the 2016 Brexit referendum would deliver a different result. They insist that people would have voted differently had they known the true costs involved. Does the public agree, and why?
I don't think Brexiteers should be worried by a second referendum. If their case is so strong, they should be confident of winning it.
It's a touch and go thing, but I think it's possible because more young people are now coming into the voting.
I think we need to think about the type of question we would ask in the second referendum, and I don't know if it's the right question to be asking about whether we should stay or leave. I'm not sure about that one.
I think when you work out the cost, and if you work out that it's going to take, it's going to be your grandchildren that may benefit in 30 years, 40 years time, then what's the point? I'll be dead by then. So
I think people are just genuinely fed up of being given promises, and then if their vote isn't accepted, then people are going to go, well, what's the whole point of this in the first place? So it would change, but I think it would permanently change the perception of politics.
All the polls are now showing the majority of British people want to remain in the European Union. So if they were to have another vote, it's pretty obvious which way it's going to go. People are much more informed now.
I don't know if we have the time for that. I don't know if it's the best option. I don't like where we are. We shouldn't be here. People of my generation have let down everyone under the age of 40 who probably voted to stay in the European Union.
See over there, there's a statue of Oliver Cromwell. And when the English Civil War was on, he won. Where's the statue to the man that lost?
I do agree that there would be a different result, and I went on the march the other weekend. 700,000 people were there or more, and particularly the young voters. I think that they're much more prepared now to come out in force and say this is our future.
Well, there's two things. One is they still don't know the true costs, because we will only find out the true costs once the thing, if it does, gets implemented. But that's part of the problem. There's been no buyer's remorse, or very little. Very few people who said they were in favour of Brexit seem to have changed their minds. It's hard to know. When it comes down to the last minute, if you had another vote, whether people would change their minds. But there's little evidence in the polls. So buyer's remorse will come after the event, when we're actually in. But then you can only get back in at a cost. So if people change their mind after we've left, then we don't get all the advantages that were negotiated by Margaret Thatcher. So we have to come in as a supplicant and take what we're offered. So the idea of leaving and getting back in is bad, but it's not clear that enough people have yet changed their minds. We don't know if there was a second referendum what the outcome would be. And if it was another narrow vote, especially if it was a narrow vote the other way, so instead of a 4% margin for Brexit, there was a 4% margin for leave, there would be civil uproar in this country.
Well, that is the argument for the people who are pushing for a second referendum. They say people don't have enough information, didn't have enough information at the time, they didn't understand it would be so complex, they couldn't see what the deal would be, which is a legitimate point, and so it's democratic to say, let's now vote on the actual deal. It's not as though we're rerunning the referendum itself, yes or no. We're just saying, here is the deal. Do you want to accept it or not? With the assumption that if people say that they don't want to accept it, then we just stay in the European Union. I think that's legitimate. But the government is saying we don't want a referendum. The Labour Party is still sitting on the fence. It says it's an option, everything's on the table, but they're not actually committing to it. But whether or not people have changed their opinion, that's hard to know. The public opinion polls don't suggest there's been much shift of an opinion. If there has been any, it would be that some Leave people have come round to Remain more than the other way round, but it's not yet clear from the polls that that's the case.
What does the public expect these Brexit talks will result in? Will the negotiations be successful or unsuccessful?
I think there will probably be a deal, because that is the nature of the European Union. They put together some kind of a deal, whatever they're doing, but it might be at the very, very, very last minute.
I think they might come up with something that placates the Tory party, but whether that would solve the Irish question and whether Jeremy Corbyn would go along with it because he's got his own agenda, I don't know.
To be honest, who knows? That's the answer to that one. We really don't know. I hope they will be successful, But again, you just don't know with how it's going. So my hope is that they will be successful.
I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no idea. But I think the talks, we will edge towards some sort of compromise, I imagine, but then there are some things that you can't, with the current structure, you can't really square off. We can't be all things to all people in this. We really can't. But we're 60 million people that are trying to make a living, and we could do without this as a backdrop.
I think no deal. I mean, I'm not being funny. We've got 4 or 5 months left. We should have been talking about where we are in the negotiations a year ago. There's no preparations in place. With how it's going, I think it's inevitable that we're going to be at loggerheads, or they're going to extend the transition process. It's only going to go either or, I think.
I think it's going to end with a vote coming back to the people, because they are in chaos in there. They do not know how... Theresa May is in a no-win situation. No matter what she does, she's lost. So it needs to come back to the people. A parliament is sovereign. And the government, to take control like this from parliament, means we have something wrong with our democracy. And we need to put that right too.
A successful Brexit is the United Kingdom remaining a successful, vocal, powerful advocate for good European Union.
It's never going to be successful because no two sides will ever agree. The two sides are so poles apart, it'll only ever be a compromise, so no side will ever be happy. I think it will take a long time to work out, but I think in the end, when the dust settles, and a few years down the line, I think it will be acceptable to both sides, and I think it will be seen as a good thing. I believe that the Europeans just take too much money, take too much of our time. The laws are just too many from Europeans to do. We're British. We've always been British. And that's how I think. I think in time it will work out, but it's going to take some time.
To me, the talks, I don't know, I can't predict. That just changes day by day. But I don't think there is such a thing as successful Brexit. I really don't. That's not a label I'm ever going to attach to it, I'm afraid. Brexit is wrong on every level. We should be staying in the European Union. That's our European family. It's what world wars were fought to keep peace in Europe and unity in Europe.
I cannot see these talks ending in an agreement. I mean, I'm not sure that I'm pleased about that or really worried, because an agreement would probably mean some kind of Brexit, not quite as hard as Mrs May's most reactionary supporters want, but still enough to do quite a lot of damage to this country and indeed to the idea of Britain as an open-minded country, with all sorts of possibilities for nationalism, chauvinism, increasing racism, and all of that is likely to result, it has already resulted and would become worse. So the alternative is no agreement, and I think that's the more likely, and no agreement will plunge Europe, but more specifically Britain, into a period of unpredictable chaos in which it's unclear whether there appears to be no majority in the Houses of Parliament for any of the outcomes, for a soft Brexit, for a hard Brexit, for no-deal Brexit. And yet it's hard to see the Conservatives getting rid of their disastrous Prime Minister, because who wants to take ownership as the new leader of the Conservatives of the mess that would result? So there is an unpredictable period of chaos, out of which something good might emerge, but it will be extremely painful.
Well, frankly, I don't know what they will result in, because nobody knows, and that's why there is so much talk of a no-deal arrangement. There's also the question of whatever deal there is, it's got to be put to the House of Commons. It also has to be put to the parliaments in all the other 27 countries. But the British Parliament is very split on the whole issue. So we don't know. There are two hurdles. One is to get a deal. Secondly is to get it through the British Parliament and through the other parliaments of the 27. So it's very hard to know. And as we were saying, it's terribly complicated. Both sides are keeping their cards held up against their chest. If there are going to be concessions, it'll be at the last minute in November. So it's really hard to say whether there will be a deal or not. My instinct would be to say there will be some sort of deal, probably, but I can't be sure.
So the stage is now set for further talks on Brexit between Theresa May and the EU leaders. They will discuss matters of relevance to the British public, who have varying levels of awareness and different opinions. Many people believe a rerun of the 2016 Brexit referendum would have a totally different result. They insist that people would have voted differently had they known the true costs involved.
And at the centre of it all is the unsolved problem of the border between the north of Ireland, which is part of the UK and scheduled to leave the EU, and the south of Ireland, which will remain within the European Union. But so far, there is no solution. The border is symbolic of a problematic line in the sand for the whole Brexit talks, a line which nobody seems able to resolve and nobody seems willing to cross.